Greetings and salutations, everyone. Welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to try to accomplish two purposes. The first of which is to briefly introduce Greek tragedy, as well as give you some terms, key terms from Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle, who wrote about Greek tragedy. The second is to just give you some thoughts and comments on Sophocles' great tragedy, Oedipus the King, as well as give you some cultural significance of the play. And of all the literature we're reading, this one has had significant impact on our modern culture. So to get us started, just a little bit about Greek tragedy. We haven't had many survive, the many centuries since the Peloponnesian War, the time of the ancient Greeks, the time that ancient Athens prospered. Much of the great Greek tragedy was written during the time of the Peloponnesian War, which was when Athens was kind of at the height of its powers, and they were at a long war with Sparta that lasted almost a century. So, of course, the Athenians eventually lost, and that kind of helped pave the way for Alexander the Great to kind of swoop in and conquer all of Greece after that. But this was the Greeks at the height of their powers. So this was way after the Iliad and the Odyssey, the epic poem. This was way after that started. So this was the Greek tragedy was a form of entertainment. I don't know how often it happens, but they would have a festival for the Greek god Dionysus, who was the god of wine and festivity. So every time they had a festival for Dionysus, that is when, they staged plays. So you notice probably from the plays that these look a lot different from a modern play. You don't really have that many characters. You could really stage a Greek tragedy with 3 or 4 actors, because for the minor parts, actors would kind of switch out. So for something like Oedipus, you had to have a wide variety of actors. For something like Oedipus, you had one actor play Oedipus. Some of the other parts could switch out, and depending on who's on stage at once. So they might do something like change their costumes or something like that, right? So that is something to consider. Of course, I've told you guys before, women didn't have much impact, in ancient Greek culture, as far as being contributors, just because it was such a patriarchal culture. So women were not on the stage even when they were women parts. So men would play women parts. That would continue all the way up to the age of Shakespeare. It would only be until, I'm thinking, the 1700s, maybe late 1600s, when women would actually be allowed to take the stage and play female parts. So someone out there correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was during the Restoration when females would play female parts, at least as far as English literature goes. France or another country might have been different. So that is another facet to consider. So there are several popular playwrights. We're going to read two tragedy writers and one comedy writer. We're going to, of course, our play for today is Oedipus by Sophocles. And we're going to read Euripides' Medea. And then another great tragedy writer was Aeschylus. I might butcher the pronunciation. I think it's Aeschylus. So correct me if I'm wrong about that one. He wrote a great poem about Agamemnon, not a great play, rather, about Agamemnon, who we know from the Iliad. This was what happened to Agamemnon after he came back from the war. So look that one up if you're so inclined. But Greek tragedy has multiple components. So like I said, not many characters at once. You notice that from probably reading it that oftentimes these characters would give these long, sort of drawn out speeches. And that is, you see that in tragedy, like in Oedipus, or you see like really short 1 or 2 lines, like you would see in Lysistrata, which is our comedy that we will be reading next week. So usually it's either in really long, drawn out monologues or just really short, quick, and to the point dialogue. So usually one of the 2 extremes. So let me talk a little bit about Aristotle. Aristotle gave a bunch of key terms that can aid us as far as looking in and examining Oedipus, our Greek tragedy. So I'm going to open a whiteboard here for us briefly to give you the terms. So Aristotle wrote a book called the Poetics, where he defines tragedy. Okay. So Aristotle believed, so just to give you some brief synopsis, Aristotle believed that tragedy should present characters as they are. He didn't think that tragedy should, embellish or show larger than life characters. Something like the Iliad would have been a little bit distasteful to Aristotle. He wanted some sort of semblance of reality, to be imitated by the art. So we're not really dealing with, literal gods in the plays. We're not dealing with the supernatural so much. We're dealing with real people. So maybe the gods are involved, but it's usually something to do with maybe they're working behind the scenes. We never see them like we would in something like the Iliad. So Aristotle believes that the plot is the end for which a tragedy exists. Without action, there's no tragedy. Aristotle believes in the beginning, middle, and the end. And he thinks that each should logically sort of follow from another. So, the play can start where it makes sense for the play to start, right? It's where it's natural to start. He says a well-constructed plot will neither begin at some chance point nor end at some chance point, but will observe the principles here stated. So unlike maybe later drama, which might start at the end and work its way back to the beginning and move forward again. That's not how Greek tragedy works, according to Aristotle. He also thought that part of Aristotle's project was to kind of start all these branches of knowledge. So we owe it to Aristotle for helping develop literary theory, but he, of course, also helped develop other branches of knowledge, a lot of the sciences. He talks a lot about history. He says in his Poetics that poetry as a genre is actually a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, and that poetry tends rather to express the universal, history rather the particular. A universal is the sort of thing that in the circumstances a certain kind of person will say or do either probably or necessarily, which in fact is the universal that poetry aims for. So poetry, maybe drama by extension, is something that will last forever. Right? Whereas history, it's about universal themes, universal subjects. Whereas history is about particular things or particular subjects. So poetry or drama tends to speak to more people than something like history would. Not to bash the historians, I myself am a historian of sorts, right? But Aristotle clearly thought that literature was a better form of knowledge than history. But some of the major terms that he gives us, one is reversal. Okay, reversal. Reversal is a change from one state of affairs to its exact opposite. So in a tragedy, there's a moment that, especially in Oedipus, because Aristotle was a gigantic fan of Sophocles, but there's a moment in a tragedy where you can kind of identify the change from one state of affairs to the opposite. And he mentions that in Oedipus, it comes when the messenger comes to cheer Oedipus up by relieving him of fear with regard to his mother. But in fact, he does the exact opposite. The messenger is the one who helps Oedipus come. He helps change the fortune of Oedipus to make him realize that he, in fact, is the cause of what's going on. So there's a moment of reversal where the character's fortunes turn. There's a moment of recognition, a change from ignorance to knowledge. So you can ask yourself, what part of the play did Oedipus, have his recognition? When did he realize that, he was the cause of everything that was happening in Thebes? Aristotle believed that evil characters can't be tragic. Of course, this is something that modern drama kind of takes exception with. Evil characters can be tragic. We oftentimes, this is called the anti-hero, right? The idea of the anti-hero today. Aristotle wouldn't have seen it that way. For instance, something like the Joker film, right? You can view him as a tragic figure if you really want to give that analysis, right? But Aristotle would clearly not think so. So he says, an extremely wicked man can't be seen falling from prosperity into misfortune, for a plot so constructed might indeed call forth human sympathy, but would not excite pity or fear, since the first is felt for a person whose misfortune is undeserved, and a second for someone like ourselves. So it's kind of hard to pity someone who does awful things. But the most important note to mention in Aristotle is the key term catharsis. Catharsis. He says that in a Greek tragedy, or in tragedy in general, there should be a moment where all of the emotions in the play, all of the tensions are kind of purged. This is the moment in which the audience kind of cleanses their souls. This is the moment where we kind of all like have a crying moment, the moment where everything is let out into the surface. So, like I said, catharsis is the purging of emotions. In Oedipus, that's pretty clear to tell where the catharsis is. Of course, it comes close to the end when he finally pokes out his eyes. So those are some key terms to think about as you work your way through Greek tragedy. That's something that I wanted you to be aware of. So for Oedipus, just to give you guys some context about Oedipus, I want to go back to my lovely, handsome face. To give you guys some context about Oedipus, of course, it's about this king, who rules over Thebes, but he becomes king by solving a riddle, a sphinx. Asks this sort of riddle. I should have written this down. The riddle that the Sphinx asks is, what walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night? And Oedipus kind of cleverly answers, mankind. As an infant, he crawls on all 4s. As an adult, he walks on 2 legs. In old age, he uses a walking stick. So an old man walks on 3 legs with a walking stick. So that's the answer that the Sphinx was looking for. The kingdom is saved and Oedipus becomes king. But little do we know that before Oedipus actually solves the riddle, he met his own father on the way to Thebes, who was the king of Thebes. So he actually murders his own father out of sort of retaliation in this sort of random outburst of violence. Of course, the father kind of provoked it, but Oedipus murders his own father. And little does he know that he was given up as a child because of a prophecy, that he would murder his parents. So he goes back to Thebes and marries his mother. He didn't know that Jocasta was his mother, but he marries her and has children with his own mother. So that is causing all this strife in Oedipus's kingdom. The god Apollo, we already know Apollo from the Iliad, curses the kingdom for this sort of filth and stink. And that's all. It's causing pestilence. It's causing women not to be able to have children, or women are having miscarriages, it says. All this misfortune is happening in Oedipus's kingdom. So this story of Oedipus, of course, the story is all about his discovery, that he is actually the one who caused all this. So the play does a number of interesting things. But the first of which is irony. So the Greek audience would have been aware of this myth when they or watching the play. This was a story that they would have known well. So when they watched the play, they were already kind of in on the fact that Oedipus marries his mother. So everything, they would have known everything. This wouldn't have come as a shock to them. Of course, it doesn't really come as a shock to us now because we're also in on the knowledge, mostly thanks to psychology, which I'll talk more about in a second. But they would have been in on the knowledge. So early in the play, there's lots of references. There's lots of foreshadowing, to the fact that Oedipus would later blind himself. There's lots of irony in the fact that he's unaware that he's the one who causes all the strife. So he's asking questions like, "I will banish the man who has caused this murder." Right? Little does he know that it was him who did it. He never thought about it until that moment. So that is irony, or that is a term to consider here. And irony in this case is showing something that's clear to the audience, but not to the character. So you can kind of trace throughout the play, all these terms that I just gave you from Aristotle. And there's a moment of recognition where Oedipus realizes that, hey, I'm the one who did this. There's a moment of reversal where the fortune starts to change. So I invite you to kind of think of what these are. So you can also ask yourself, you can go really deep into character analysis of Oedipus if you so choose. Oedipus, he's quick to judge here. Right? He's really quick to judge. He blames Tiresias the prophet as well as his uncle Creon. He doesn't know Creon's his uncle. He thinks he's just his brother-in-law. But he blames Creon for trying to usurp his throne. Right? So Oedipus seems really insecure throughout the play. So that's a character trait to consider. But play interrogates a number of themes. One theme that you can think about is the theme of blindness. Of course, our prophet Tiresias is a prophet of Apollo. Apollo is the one who gives him these prophecies. Tiresias is blind, right? Tiresias can't see. He has his inner eye that allows him to see things, but he can't literally see. So there's lots of even irony throughout the play about that. Oedipus, you have eyes, but I'm the one who clearly sees what's going on here. So there's lots of sort of instances with this kind of thing. There's also blindness. Of course, Oedipus later puts himself blind, and out of shame and for what he did. You can also kind of, the theme of fate comes in here as well, as it always does in Greek literature. Fate. So you can ask yourself, should we feel sympathy for Oedipus? Right? He seems to be a cruel victim of fate here. He didn't know that he was marrying his own mother. He didn't know that he murdered his own father. Of course, but you can also ask yourself, is murder ever okay? Right? He does murder, and that helps lead to this downfall that he comes to. So you can ask yourself the question, is Oedipus a good man? Did he deserve what he got? Another theme is, of course, sexuality. This idea of of Oedipus has actually influenced modern psychology. If you can call this idea modern, it's over 100 years old. But the great psychologist Sigmund Freud came up with the idea of what he called the Oedipus complex, to describe early childhood development. So Freud read this play, this idea of a man marrying his own mother unconsciously, right? He didn't know. He felt attraction to his mother because obviously he wouldn't have married her otherwise. He had children with his mother. Freud came up with this idea that when a male child is extremely young, still trying to process things, he develops an over attachment to his mother, which Freud argues that the child develops even like a sexual attachment to the mother. And what happens is at some point, the child realizes that that's taboo, right? That's not acceptable, to feel that way about your mother. Usually that's because of the father. The father figure comes in and shows the child that, hey, this isn't right. Freud calls that castration of sorts, right? That is the first moment of castration in a male child. And that is when trauma, that's almost a male child's first moment of trauma, right? When he realizes that he can't have his mother, that's taboo. So, and that causes this is the first of many issues that we experience that causes all of our psychological problems. So Freud came up with this idea from Sophocles' tragedy. Interestingly enough, the same that is true for women with their father figures, and that comes from another Sophocles play called Electra. Electra is the name of the other Sophocles play, where he develops that idea about women and their over attachment to their fathers. So every time you hear the term daddy issues or mother issues for men, well, you can trace this back to Greek tragedy. So, I mean, you have to ask yourself, though, was this fated? Is Oedipus a victim? Or did he unconsciously want to be with his mother, right? Is that, can we blame the gods for what Oedipus did? So this is an argument that you can make yourself as well. There's lots of other characters that are interesting in the play. We do have Oedipus's children. Oedipus kind of curses them close to the end, right? Saying, to talk about Greek views on women, there's nothing more damning almost than Oedipus's speech close to the end of the play, where he talks about his daughters slash sisters. He says, and when you're ripe for marriage, who will he be? The man who will risk to take such infamy as shall cling to my children to bring hurt on them and those that marry with them. What curse is not there? Your father killed his father and sowed the seed where he had sprung himself and begat you out of the womb that held him. These insults you will bear. Then who will marry you? No one, my children. Clearly you are doomed to waste away in barrenness unmarried. So he kind of says, hey, my own Creon, you better take care of my daughters because they're going to be useless. No man is going to want to marry them. Nothing in the ancient Greek world would have been worse than that for a woman, right? You didn't want to be a spinster in these times, right? Because I said, in ancient Greece, women did not have much authority. It was very patriarchal. We have Jocasta, we have Creon, the uncle. We also have a chorus. I didn't mention the chorus yet, but the chorus is kind of a representation of the people as a whole. So oftentimes in Greek plays, you'll see this figure of the chorus, right? And that's what it's meant to be, the voice of the people, so to speak. So lots of characters kind of get lumped in as the chorus. So that's something to keep track of as you read through Euripides' Medea as well. So hopefully that's enough. Some nice introductory material to Oedipus. I'll look forward to seeing what you guys write about it. Until next time.